Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's doing great. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Good afternoon, Arlindo.
Good.
Yes.
Good afternoon. It's good to be back with our meetings. See you guys again. It's very good. I hope everybody's doing great. Today we're going to talk about it, review the changes on the ASIS contract, and also the addendums. The addendum for the conduct rider was changed, and a few other addendums. And we have John with us, and he's going to go over all the changes. All right. So remind you guys that those meetings are being recorded, and we post them in our website. So in the future, if you need to see them again, you can go back to the website and then play the recording video one more time. Or you can either give me a call or call John. All right, great. So another thing is that we're going to be doing our meetings again. To start with, we're going to do the meetings once a month, and then we see how it goes, and we go from there. And in the meantime, if there's any emergency or anything that is important that we need to bring it to you, then we will have meetings in between. Okay, great. During the meeting, guys, if you have any question, please come up and ask the question. John, are you with us, John?
Yes, sir. Hi, everyone.
Hey, John, thank you again for your support to be here with us and bring all those changes. And I'm going to transfer the host to you. So you can present. You can, let me find you here. I found it out.
John, you look younger every time I see you.
Yeah, right.
It's
John
the
looks
screen.
young every time we see him.
It lies. What's up, Scotty?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Alicia.
Hi, John.
Scott, good to see you, Scott, and everybody else. I see Alicia here, Tamara, it's one of the first.
Hey, Arlindo.
Hey, how are you? Natalie's here.
Good to see you.
Lindo.
Hi. Okay, John,
Natalie.
it's all yours.
All right.
Same problem that I
Go with screen 3. Okay. So as Arlindo mentioned, we're going to touch on some of the highlights of the new as-is contract that came out last year. We went over in depth last time, so I'm not going to do that again, but I'm going to touch on the important parts and a lot of questions that I get from realtors on certain sections. So we'll go through that. And as Arlindo mentioned, if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to just jump right in. Okay. Oh, I'm getting requests for okay. So quickly, let's just go over line 1 and 2. Everyone can see the contract, right? Arlindo, you can see it?
Yes.
Okay. So buyer and seller information goes here, as we talked about last time. Do not put owner of record as the seller. Actually find out who the seller is and make sure you put their information there. For buyer, if you have one buyer, obviously just put their name. If there's 2 buyers, make sure both buyers' names are here and both buyers' initial and sign. Address goes here, as we talked about. Located, remember this is a county, not country. So you put Miami-Dade or Broward there. The first questions I get a lot on is this section here, subsection D. Remember that what's included is listed here. Refrigerator, ranges, ovens, dishwasher, disposal. These are the automatically included items. They do not include a washer and dryer. So some units come with a washer and dryer, even some houses. So make sure to include that here if it's included in the sale, because sometimes the buyer might think it's included, And then come closing, walkthrough day, the washer and dryer are gone. And those can be expensive items, so make sure it's included here. Another thing I see a lot of in the contracts is someone will put fully furnished, and they'll just leave it like that. They won't put anything else. Please include the additional language here that an inventory list is needed, and it's to be provided by the seller within 3 days after the effective date. Make sure you put a time frame too. That way, both parties are aware of what's included and what's not included. This language is very important. If you represent a seller and the seller says, hey, I'm going to give all my furniture except I want to take the chandelier, or I want to take some paintings, make sure to include excluded items here. Now remember, this line 24, these are excluded and these are included. Sometimes I have seen fully furnished on this line. So remember, first line 21 is included, line 24 is excluded. Purchase price obviously goes here. Deposits, I get a lot of questions on the amount of deposits. What should I do? You all know it's a crazy market right now. It's so seller centered that no longer can you put 500 or 1,000. You might have to do 5% or even 10% to try and win the bid. So the deposit goes here. If there is financing, put the financing amount here, and then the balance goes here. The computer, I believe, does that. Time for acceptance. You don't want to have an open contract out there for as long as whenever the seller wants to sign it. It's best to put a date here, and usually 3 or 5 days for the seller to make a decision is a good time frame. Closing date now is on this page here, the top of the second page. And since there might be some negotiations back and forth, or maybe it'll take 3 or 5 or a week to get a fully executed contract, it's always best to put on or before a certain amount of days. And if it's financing, make sure to put at least 45 days. The way the market is now, lenders are so busy. You want to make sure you give your buyer enough time to get their financing. So it's best to put on or before, and pick, if it's a cash deal, we as a title company, we can close in as soon as 2 weeks. But for financing, make sure to put maybe at least 45 days. I know sellers might not like that. So if they do want 30 days or 35 or 40, make sure you tell your buyer to get in contact with their mortgage broker and ask them, can you do it in 35 days or 30 days? The default answer from the mortgage broker, God bless them, is yeah, no problem, we can do it. But sometimes there's difficulties and delays in getting documents. So the more time you can put here, the better for your buyer. Okay, occupancy and possession. This talks about tenancies, right? So this line here, line 65 and 66, seller shall at closing deliver occupancy and possession of the property to buyer free of tenants and occupants, right? So that means that the unit must be vacant. If there is a tenant in the property and they're staying after closing, this box must be checked right here, 6B. And then what happens is the seller has to give the written lease to buyer within 5 days after the effective date. And the buyer gets a chance to review the lease to make sure that the monthly payments are good, or the rent is good, and there's enough security deposit, maybe last month's rent, and also to determine the length of the lease. And then if buyer determines that buyer, in their sole discretion, does not like how the lease is played out, or maybe it's a 5-year lease or something and they want to move in before that, the buyer may terminate the contract by delivering written notice of such election to seller within 5 days after receipt of the above items, okay? So after closing, seller has 5 days to give the lease to the buyer, and buyer has 5 days to decide if they want to move forward or not. Signability, this is a new change that happened in the new contract. If you don't check a box, then automatically the third box is checked that says may not assign. I highly recommend always checking off this first box, which is the second box in the group, but the first box on line 84 that says may assign, because sometimes you'll get a question, or we will get a question from a buyer, hey, I want to buy it under a trust, or I want to buy it under an LLC. This language allows us to prepare an assignment of contract without having to get the seller's signature. So always check off this box here if you can. Paragraph 8, financing, obviously A for cash and B for financing. And again, if you can put 45 days here instead of 30, that would be highly beneficial to your client. We touch about what happens if we do and don't get loan approval, so we'll pass over that. Closing costs, we get questions on who pays for what are the closing costs? It's under paragraph 9 of the contract. The main numbers here, the largest expenses are the doc stamps, and the doc stamps are paid by the seller for the deed. And if there is a mortgage, the buyer pays the doc stamps on the mortgage. The other fees are basically search fees, title search, lien search, and estoppel. Those usually around $250 each. Okay, checking off who pays for these expenses. Since we're in Miami-Dade and Broward, always check off this provision. This says that the seller pays for the lien search and title search, and the buyer pays for the title insurance. So check off subsection 3. Warranty special assessments. Okay, still getting questions on this one. This is a very important section of the contract. Special assessments, and sometimes people will just look at that and they'll go straight to the boxes and check off who pays for what. But please make sure you read the sentence right after it, which says the special assessments here talk about liens imposed by a public body. Now, what's a public body? The next sentence says, public body does not include condominium or HOAs. This is only for the city. The city wants to do, maybe improve the roads or put some sewers or lights or whatnot, and it's not in their budget, they can pass a special assessment to all the homeowners in that county or city. But it does not apply to condominiums and homeowner associations. So whether there is a special assessment passed by an association, this section does not apply to that. We have to look to the condominium rider, and then the condominium rider tells us who pays for the special assessments, okay? So please be very careful of this section. This does not apply whatsoever to associations. So regardless of what you check off here, special assessments passed by an association is not here to look. Okay. Government disclosures, move, like that. Okay. Property tax. I just want to touch on this real quick regarding prorations. Proration for property tax is, as everyone knows, property taxes in Florida are paid in arrears, which means they're due at the end of the year. So if we're closing, let's just say in general, in June, the middle of the year, of this year, June 2022, the property tax has not come out yet, right? It's due at the end of the year. So what's going to happen on the HUD is the seller is going to give a credit to the buyer from January 1st to June, basically 6 months. Because when the bill comes out at the end of the year, the buyer is responsible to pay for the whole thing. So property taxes, just so you know, if your client asks, because some of them are from the Northeast and North and different areas, certain states have different requirements for property taxes when they're due. Some states require them to be paid at the beginning of the year, but in Florida, property taxes are due at the end of the year for that year. FERPTA, another very important part of the contract.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to point out 2 things. As we said in the past in one of our meetings, and we're going to repeat that on our next meeting, is reviewing the closing statement. And it was a very interesting meeting when we had it, because a lot of our agents were not aware that it's the broker's responsibility to review the closing statement before you submit to the seller or the buyer 3 days prior to closing. And we're going to look into those closing statements and see how we can review those numbers. Because as John was mentioning here on the property taxes, yes, we know that if we close in June, the seller needs to credit the buyer from January to June. And it's our responsibility as an agent to review that that number is corrected and was actually debited the seller and credit the buyer. And that goes also for the rent if the unit is rented. Now, John, I'd like to go back to one thing that you pointed. You know, I was dealing with something and I couldn't interrupt you and you were in a good speed. It's about the new open window for the buyer if he's buying a property that is rented. Can you bring back that line, please?
Sure. Those are in the paragraph 6. Okay.
Yes. Right there. On line 76 says that if at buyer's sole discretion, decide that the terms of the leasing is not suitable for the buyer, then the buyer can give a written notice within 5 days after receive the contract. Now, just for everybody to understand, it's a situation here that we need to ask questions about it. What if an agent failed to collect the lease agreement after they signed the contract, and the seller, the buyer didn't see the lease agreement? What would be the problem for the agent for not collecting that leasing agreement? John?
You want me to answer, or are you asking your agents?
No. You.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. What happens if the lease is not presented as it should be?
Yes. Talking about the agent who represents the buyer.
Okay, so number one, we look to the contract, right? We always go to the contract and we have to read the terms. And it says there that the lease shall be disclosed in writing by seller to buyer. So first responsibility is on the seller to advise the buyer that there is a tenant. Maybe when they did the walkthrough, the tenant wasn't there, or maybe the tenant moved in after the walkthrough. So first responsibility is on the listing agent to tell the parties that there is a tenant. And then that seller must provide a written lease to the buyer within 5 days after the effective date. So what happens is, obviously the listing agent is not going to give it directly to the buyer. They're going to give it to an agent. And then now it's your responsibility as an agent to deliver that lease to the buyer so the buyer can review it, because the buyer has 5 days to do so. If after the 5th day, the buyer doesn't have any objection, then the buyer has to move forward. So if you do not present the lease to the buyer and the buyer thinks at the closing date that he's moving in, and apparently there's a tenant in there that's supposed to stay there for another 9 months, that can be a big, big problem. So you have to be very careful with leases to make sure you get the lease, and then also to make sure you give the lease to your client.
This is the thing. The fact that the house will be occupied after the closing, it was always a problem. And if you don't make sure that the house will be vacant and the buyer has the intention to move into the property, this is something new. It becomes a new responsibility for the buyer's agent to collect the lease agreement and deliver the lease agreement to the buyer within 5 days after the effective date. Because now the buyer has a chance to look into the lease agreement, and if he doesn't like anything in it, he can cancel the contract. So now we talk about something different, not about being occupied after closing. It's about agent failed to collect the lease agreement from the seller and deliver it to the buyer within 5 days after the effective date. You have any information about what could happen to the agent if he failed to do that?
Yeah, so now the buyer says, okay, so I was expecting to move in on day one. So now I can't move in. So now I have to rent, or I have to find another house. All those expenses are going to be the responsibility of the agent to cover.
Mhm.
Not only that, you're going to have an upset client, which you never want. And then the client could potentially file a complaint with the DPPR or an ethics complaint. And then you're in such a mess that I recently saw a complaint filed against a realtor. It was 50 pages long. And it was an unmerited claim, but the agent still needs to respond. And now they got to get their broker involved. Now they got to get lawyers involved. So it's a big process. It's not to be taken lightly. You have to protect yourself, and you always have to protect your client.
Yes, great, John, thank you. Just thinking about this one more time, this is something new, and now it becomes our responsibility to collect one extra document that we were not aware or we are not used to collect it before. So if we continue doing things the way we're doing before this change, we might fail to collect the lease agreement and deliver the lease agreement to the buyer. It's not only about the occupancy after the closing, it's more like John gave the example. What if the lease is for 5 years and the buyer doesn't want to? The buyer was aware that the house was going to be occupied after closing, but he was not aware of the terms of the lease. And this term says if the buyer does not like the terms of the lease, then he can cancel. But in order for him to cancel, he needs to receive a copy within 5 days after the effective date. All right, John, thank you so much. You can continue. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, good point. And also you raised a good point about the taxes. And if you do get a question about it, the question is, how do you calculate the taxes? Well, we have to use last year's taxes. So let's say last year's taxes for easy accounting was $12,000. So at time of closing, if the closing is in June, the seller has to give the buyer $6,000 credit at closing. And the buyer is responsible for the other $6,000. At the end of the year, they pay the whole $12,000. So that's how that proration works. Okay. FIRPTA, this is also very important to explain to your sellers who are foreigners. This just happened recently where an agent told us that the seller was a foreigner. We said, okay, here's the contact information for an intermediary. They have to hire a company to prepare the documents. So FIRPTA is important if you represent the seller to ask them if they're a foreigner. Now they can have a green card, right? Or a social security number, but if they are foreign, we as a title company have to collect 15% of the sale price at time of closing. Now the seller doesn't lose this money, we're holding it. And basically what has to happen is the seller needs to file a tax return for the property, basically telling the government if they made any money, if there's any capital gains. If there is a capital gain, the government says, okay, so you made 100,000, we're going to tax you 25, 20, 30%. You owe us 30,000 and the rest of the money can go back to the seller. So if you do represent a seller, the whole 15% is not going to the government. We're just holding it. The government wants us to hold more because they want to make sure that if there is something missing, that they don't have to chase the seller for it. So FIRPTA is for foreign sellers. Okay. Another big question, another thing to know about and be concerned about is the property inspection section, paragraph 12. Now, this is not only the inspection section, this is also, and I highlighted here, it's a right to cancel section. So the buyer does not have to do an inspection to cancel. They have an opportunity to do an inspection. but they also have the right to cancel based on their sole discretion. So during the 15 days, if you leave it blank, or 10 or 7 or 3, if the buyer decides in the buyer's sole discretion, so that means if whatever the buyer, they don't even have to give a reason, in their sole discretion, that they don't like the property, they changed their mind, they found something else. During this time, the buyer may terminate the contract by delivering written notice. Obviously, you have to give written notice prior to expiration of the 15 days, and the buyer gets the deposit back. Now, on the 16th day, this contingency becomes waived. So you no longer have that right to cancel. So this is just wanted to point out that it's also a right to cancel and not just the inspection period. Good. Walkthroughs, this is important. The buyer is allowed to do it on the day before closing or the day of closing. It's a right that's given to the buyer, and it's right here in the contract. And this is where you find it on line 275. I highly recommend doing walkthroughs, especially if there's furniture being left behind, to make sure that it's all there, and also to make sure that there's no damage to the unit when the seller moved out. So what usually happens is, what you can do is during the closing or on the closing date, you schedule the walkthrough in the morning and then sign the documents in the afternoon. Okay, so we're going to talk about permits real quick. You know, I always tell you guys to add that additional language in the additional terms section that says the seller is responsible for any and all permits. This is the reason why. In this section here, it says that the seller will assist closing out any building permits, but in this highlighted section here, it says that the seller shall not be required to expend or become obligated to expend any money in closing out the permits. So I guess the general idea of this contract was, hey, look, it's as is, the buyer's buying it with all the issues. So that's why in the additional terms section, and we'll see it as we scroll down a little bit later, that I want you guys to add that the seller is responsible to close out any and all permits, because then it puts the onus on them to pay for it. Because if you don't, and there are open permits, buyer can help, the seller can help the buyer, but the seller does not have to spend any money. And those can be big issues too. If there was a permit that was supposed to be pulled, maybe they redid the kitchen without permits, the inspector can force the removal of whatever was installed and have it redone, and that could be very costly. So make sure to add that additional language in the additional term section. Good. We'll continue on. Default. What happens in defaults? So always look to this section of the contract, paragraph 15, and this tells us what happens, and depends on who's at default. So if the buyer is at default, we look at paragraph 15A. Buyer fails to do something that they were supposed to do under the contract, including payment of the deposit. A lot of people come up to me and say, hey, they didn't do the deposit, so they're backing out and everything should be fine. Nope, that's not true. The obligation of the contract was for the buyer to put a deposit within a certain amount of time. So if they don't do that, buyer is in breach, and it's a buyer default. So what happens if the buyer defaults? On line 338, seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit. Okay, so any buyer default, whatever requirement is required by the buyer under the contract, if they don't do it, they're in default and the seller can retain the deposit. Now, what happens if the seller says, oh, I don't want to sell it to you anymore, I actually found another buyer for a higher price. You can just take your deposit and go. No, if the seller defaults in any way, the buyer actually has two options. The buyer can actually say, fine, okay, I'll take my deposit back and I'll look for something else, or the buyer can force the seller, and it's called specific performance in legal terms. The buyer can force the seller to sell the property to the buyer. So that's what happens regarding defaults and who does them. Now, what happens if there is a discrepancy about, oh, there was an issue, you didn't do something that you were supposed to do, but then the seller says, well, you didn't do something you were supposed to do. So now we have a controversy. And what do we do with controversies? We go to paragraph 16. Unresolved controversies have to go to dispute resolution. And what that means is the parties have to go to mediation. So you have to follow the rules of mediation. I know Scott's actually done that a couple of times. So if you do have to go to that, Scott's a great source to walk you through how to go through mediation. Okay, we'll continue on. Okay, time periods, huge issue regarding contracts. And it's very important that you all know that you calculate time by calendar days, no longer business days or 5 p.m. or anything like that. Calendar days. So what does that mean? Calendar days includes Saturdays and Sundays. So if we have a contract that is effective today, today's Thursday, let's say it's 10 days. We count Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We go to Thursday of next week. We count the calendar days. So let's say it was 10 days and now we go to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The 10th day falls on a Sunday. We then go to the next calendar day, which is Monday, right? So that's how that works. Be very careful with timing because these are big, big issues when deposits are due, when the inspection period is done, when the financing period is done. It's calendar days. Make sure to include Saturdays and Sundays. Prorations we talked about. I just wanted to include here that there's basically two prorations. There's prorations for taxes, right, where the seller is giving a credit to the buyer because it's not due yet. But then there's a proration for association dues. Let's say we close on January 15th and the seller paid all of January's dues. So at time of closing, what happens is the buyer is giving a credit to the seller for the rest of the month. So that's how the prorations work for association dues and real estate taxes. There's basically just those two. Now, I just highlighted this real quick just so you all know. If you need to do appraisals or inspections or walkthroughs, you have to give reasonable notice to the seller. You just can't knock on the door and say, hey, we're here to do the inspection or the walkthrough. No. Be respectful of both parties. Make sure you give reasonable notice. Now, what is reasonable notice? Yeah, well, that's up for debate, but at least I'd say a day or two. And also you can't schedule it at 1 in the morning. It has to be within reasonable times as well. So just be cognizant of that. Okay, 1031 exchange. What happens here is if a seller wants to sell their property and not get taxed on the capital gains, they can hire a company to hold the money and then use that money to buy something else. So if you do have a client that is an investor, it's always good just to touch base with them and say, hey, what are you going to do with these funds? Are you planning on buying something else? And they say, yeah, I'll probably use the money to buy another investment property. Okay, so it's best to say, well, there's an opportunity and there's a program with the government that you can avoid paying capital gains tax if you use a 1031 exchange. And that's basically as far as you should go. And if they say, okay, yeah, I'm interested, then you can refer them to me and let me give them legal advice regarding 1031 exchanges. But it's a great tool for them. And it's also good for you because then you'll get another sale regarding the purchase. But if they do want to do it, they have to contact the 1031 exchange intermediary company before closing. It can't be done after closing. Once we as a title company get the money and we send it to the seller, that's it. They've already received the money. They can't now give it back and then give it to the intermediary. So this needs to be done before closing. And also, we as a title company, we're not a 1031 exchange company. It's a completely separate company that needs to be hired to hold the money. So usually it takes a week to do all the documents because there's the federal government involved, there's taxes involved.
Hello?
Yeah.
Paulette says hi.
Hi, Paula.
Hi. Yeah, babe.
Did you have a question
Hello?
about this or just saying hello?
Oh, what happened? Did I screw it? Hmm.
Eugene, what's up? What are you doing, girl? Okay, so the reason I bring this up is it did happen recently that we were at a closing and the seller says, hey, I want to do a 1031 exchange. Well, it's too late for that. You have to at least give this 1031 exchange company a week to prepare all the documents. So that's it regarding 1031s. Okay, regarding notices, and we've talked about this many times, just a refresher, all notices must be given in writing, and you can do that by email. We talked about no text messages, no Instagram, no WhatsApp or anything like that. Everything must be in writing, and the best way to do it in writing is by mail or email. And also notice this, that notices and delivery given by or to the attorney or broker, including broker's real estate agent, representing any party, shall be as effective as giving it to that party. So as we talked about, let's say that lease, that the listing agent gives you, the buyer's agent, the lease. Now the seller has actually, it's considered being given to the buyer. So the seller has done their responsibility. Now you have to do your responsibility and make sure you give it to the buyer, because it's considered as if your receipt is the buyer's receipt. So be very careful of that. You can't say, well, my buyer never received it. Actually, if you received it, it means the buyer received it. So be very careful of that. Okay, so now we get to the addendum section. I've seen this, be very careful with this. It's not A and B, it's either a condominium or a homeowners association. It's never both. So don't check both, it's either or. And right before we get to the riders, as we talked about, here's the language that you need to put for permits. If there exists any open, needed, or expired permits or violations, then seller shall, at seller's sole cost and expense, close out any and all permits and or violations prior to closing. Before I used to just say open or expired. Now let's make sure we're included needed, because an issue came up where someone did work on a unit but didn't pull the permits that they needed to pull. So just to be safe here, we want to also include needed to cover the buyer. What we're always doing here is we're protecting the buyer, because protecting the buyer protects us from any issues going down. And don't forget here, this is where the best part is. You put your information here on line 634, and you put One Way Realty Group on line 636. And now, a huge question that always comes up. Okay, so the MLS says that it's 5% commission, 2.5% to each. You don't agree to that, so you put dash and you put 3% here. Everyone signs it, everything's good. You go to closing and you're expecting your 3%, but you're only entitled to 2.5%. And here's why. The contract says right here that this contract shall not modify any MLS or other offer of compensation made by seller or listing broker or cooperating brokers. So whatever number you put here, doesn't matter. You can even put 10%. Buyer and seller will sign it. It holds no water. You always have to look to the MLS, and the MLS controls. Okay, so be very careful of that as well. Okay, so that was just a brief, not so brief discussion of the new contract. Any questions here before we move on to the riders? Okay. The riders, we're going to start with the homeowners. Go ahead. Okay, so They actually have not revised the condominium rider yet. They're still working out some issues, trying to implement things regarding the Surfside tragedy. So the new condo rider is not out yet, but they did revise the homeowner association rider. Really, the revision was on the second page. Basically, they added the part where if there is association approval, to let the parties know yes or no. And then if there is a special assessment, so as we talked about, remember in that part of the contract that talked about special assessments for public bodies, it doesn't apply to a homeowner association. This is where it applies. And this is where you check off who's going to pay for special assessments, buyer and seller. And this is what holds the parties to pay for any special assessments. Okay, so it's here, and also in the condominium rider, there's this section similar to this that basically has a box here, buyer or seller. So if you represent a buyer, always check off seller, because you don't know if there's any special assessments and you want the seller to pay for it, because they can be costly. So this is the section where you want to be aware of. Next, this rider is not used very often. It's for VAs, but they just changed some things here. Nothing too important for us. Next, right to inspect, right to cancel. This is used for the regular contract, not the as-is contract, because the as-is contract, as I pointed out, has this language already in there, the right to cancel, right to inspect. But the regular contract doesn't. So if you're using a regular contract, you would want to add this to it. A lot of sellers don't accept regular contracts. If you try sending it to them with a regular contract, they'll say, hey, you need to resend it in an as-is contract. So if you do use a regular contract, it's good to have this in there. Okay, pre-closing occupancy by buyer. If there is an issue and the buyer needs to move in before the closing date, you'd use this addendum. And basically what they did was, instead of requiring a lease, they also are allowing for pre-closing occupancy agreements or other similar agreements instead of actually preparing a lease. So this is good. This one's, it's important if the buyer needs to move in early or needs to move stuff in. This is what is a good one to use. Now, this is actually a popular one nowadays, and it's actually good if you want to make an offer and the seller still hasn't found their place, or the seller needs a little bit of time to move out their stuff. You want to be, you want to work with the seller so they'd like your offer against others. So you can allow the seller to stay after closing for a certain amount of time to move out any stuff that they need to. And this is the addendum that you'd use for that. Sale of buyer's property. This is a good one. If you have a buyer that is selling a property, and then after that sale, they want to buy a property, this is a good addendum to use. It used to be back in the day, right, a little bit difficult to sell a property, so that's why buyers would use this. But nowadays, as you all know, you can put a property on the market and it can be gone in a day or two. So, but it's still good to use just in case you don't want to lock up the buyer into a purchase where they don't have the money to purchase it. And then again, if they don't have the money to purchase it, they'll lose their deposit and they'll be upset with you. So this is a good one to use if that buyer is in that situation. Backup contracts, these are very popular nowadays because there's several contracts that sellers are accepting. If you're not the first one, but seller says, well, we're accepting backup offers, you would use this addendum and attach it to your offer. So the Florida Association of Realtors and Florida Bar added some new riders, and they are as follows. Mold inspection. Surprising that they didn't have this one, but let's say you visit a property but while you're in there, before you make an offer, you can tell that it kind of smells a little funny, or you actually see mold in certain areas. Definitely include a mold inspection addendum to protect your buyer. Also, nowadays, this is very popular. There are seasonal and vacation rentals that the sellers are doing, and these are usually short-term, right? 7 days or 14 days or a week or a month. Make sure if you're a seller, realtor, that you advise the buyer, you have to give notice that, by the way, after closing, there's a short-term rental in there that's scheduled that we couldn't cancel, that's going to be staying on a certain amount of time during these dates. You have to fill out this addendum and also give that short-term rental agreement to the buyer to review. Okay, so this is that addendum to use for that. PACE addendum. This talks about the property assessed clean energy. There is a program that allows sellers to borrow money from the government to do repairs to the property for new windows or solar powers or any energy efficient renewable energy product. If the seller did do that, you have to give this rider, because at closing, we as a title company need to contact the government and ask them for a payoff, because it's the seller's responsibility to make sure that that's paid before closing. And that is it, my friends. Those are the new riders and an update on the as-is contract. Do you have any questions? If you do, and you don't want to ask them here, you have my phone number or email. Feel free to give me a call. And also, I mentioned it's always a good idea if you're kind of new at this, or you're not sure about something. If you prepared a contract, email it to me. It takes me all of 2 minutes just to kind of look over. There's certain things that I look for. There's not much to change in the contract, right? But there are certain things that we have to be careful for, like this section here, and certain boxes that need to be checked. So feel free. I don't charge for it. Just say, hey, John, can you review this contract? I'll take a quick look at it and then send you on your way. All right. Any questions? If not, I'll turn it back over to you, Orlando.
Yes, John, thank you. Thank you for the explanation. It was great to review the as-is contract again and looking into all those changes on the disclosures. Now, guys, as you heard John saying, you guys can ask any question now if you have any, or you can address the question to John or to me. In the meantime, before our next meeting, you can continue doing what you're doing. You have any questions, you give me a call. If you wanted me to review anything, you send it to me or send it to John. Remember, we're a team, we work together, and it's been a good partnership. I think for more than 7 years, right, John? We've been working together.
Yeah, you don't want to date us too much, but it's been a nice long time.
Yeah, it's been nice. We've been working together, and John has always been available to help you guys with any legal questions that you might have. Okay. Next meeting will be on February 24 at the same time at 1 p.m. We're going to be talking about reviewing the disclosure, the closing statement, and we're going to look into some important disclosure that you have to have in your contract if you are representing a buyer. Guys, if you don't have any questions right now, we're going to end the meeting. I'm going to open for 30 seconds. If you have any questions, this is your time.
Thank you, Lindo.
All right, guys, thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys in the next meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Linda. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindo.
Thank you.